Introduction to Information Security. Objective. This introduction is aimed at imparting a basic understanding of what information security is all about, and covers a broad spectrum of topics in the information security arena. Outcome. At the end of this chapter, you will have a clear understanding of concepts related to information security. Data then. Data is simply a collection of facts or values which may exist in different forms, as numbers or text on pieces of paper, as bits and bytes stored in electronic memory, or just as facts in a person's mind. Now, getting back on track, what is information? Data, when arranged in a convenient form for a specific purpose, is known as information. To put it in another way, information may be credit card numbers, debit card numbers, PIN numbers, Gmail passwords, Facebook passwords, router passwords, and bank account PIN numbers, and so on. An organized set of data is called information. Types of data. Data can be classified as publicly available data, confidential data, and restricted or private data. When data is publicly available to all, it is known as publicly available data. Example: a bank's balance sheets and insurance policy details, a government's tender notices and job posts held by authorities. When data is available only to the people involved in a process or an organization, in other words, it is restricted from unauthorized access, it is called confidential data. Example: a manufacturing company's market forecast data, test cases and standards, a bank's customer data consisting of the addresses and phone numbers, or a government's sensitive scientific and medical research data. When the data is super sensitive, in other words, leakage may lead to serious issues, it is known as restricted or private data. Example: a company's system designs and trade secrets, financial account PIN numbers, an email password, personal report, or medical reports of a person. Having seen the different types of data sets that are nothing but information, what is the need for information security? What if a credit card PIN becomes available for everyone? What if the number of missiles held by a nation is known worldwide? What if the system design and test case for a new product of a company is accessible by their competitor? And what if a tender quotation of all the applicants is accessible by all the other applicants? Do you think it is good to go about without securing this information? Of course not. Let us now get into information security. No one knew that the US had nuclear weapons. The then President of the USA, Franklin D. Roosevelt, approved of the Manhattan Project that paved the way for the creation of the Little Boy and Fat Man in 1939 itself. 6 years from then, after the demise of Roosevelt, when Harry S. Truman took over as president in 1945, he approved the dropping of the bombs in the Japanese cities. If the Japanese or the rest of the world had known about this earlier, they would have started developing their own nuclear weapons. The information was kept secret, but now over time, this information is available to all. Information gets dissipated over time. It is all about how it is being guarded at the moment. When the information is not secured enough, it becomes available to everyone. This weakness or gap in the system, which may allow an intruder to gain access to the information system, is known as vulnerability. When an intruder is able to use this vulnerability to arrive at sensitive data in the system, it is termed as an exploit. It has always been a tug of war between the terms vulnerability and threat. What is a threat, and how does it differ from vulnerability? Threat is a factor that can cause harm to a system, and the system has no control over it. But A vulnerability is a flaw in the system itself, which can definitely be treated. When explained like this, what are the possible threats? Threats can be classified broadly into two types: environmental threats and man-made threats. Environmental threats. Environmental threats can be caused due to environmental conditions or natural disasters. In times of extreme temperatures, humidity, power failures, heavy downpour causing floods, etc., the environmental conditions pose a great threat to the information system in one way or the other. Apart from this, natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, or landslides pose a threat to an information system. Man-made threats. Human errors and weaknesses make up most of the man-made threats. An employee is the greatest asset as well as the most dangerous possible threat to an organization. The first category of man-made threats are caused by the employees. This is also known as an insider threat. This may be unintentional as well as intentional. An employee may unknowingly leave his PC unlocked while going for a break, which would pave the way for another disgruntled employee of the same organization to gain access to the system and steal data from the system. The former is an unintentional threat, while the latter falls under intentional threat. The second category of man-made threats are caused intentionally by people outside the organization, also called external human threats. A member outside the organization attacking the information system with a malicious intent is called a hacker. Intentional threats are caused by individuals with motivations that can be categorized as political, economic, and socio-cultural. Political motivations are aimed at destroying or taking control of the target system, posting irrelevant and controversial political statements. The people carrying out such activities are called hacktivists. Example: cyberterrorism. Economic motivations are aimed at earning money by stealing intellectual data and selling it to the organization's competitors, also called cyber espionage. Installing ransomware like CryptoLocker and encrypting the data on a target's machine and blackmailing the target to pay a ransom in order to get the decryption key. Personal motivations are aimed at satisfying the self out of a sense of curiosity or a desire to get publicity by causing psychological damage to the target via social networking sites. This is also called cyberstalking. Types of hackers. A hacker intentionally exploiting a vulnerability in a system with authorization but without a malicious intent is known as a white hat hacker. These are actual security guys deployed as security admins. A hacker who intentionally attacks a system with a malicious intent is called a black hat hacker or a cracker. Apart from these two types of hackers, there are grey hat hackers who exhibit the traits from both the white and black hats. For example, if a white hat hacker found a vulnerability in a system and exploited it with authorization, but revealed it publicly instead of reporting it to the organization who had authorized him, he would be exhibiting a trait of a black hat hacker, so then he would be called a grey hat hacker. When an amateur hacker breaks into systems using pre-packaged automated scripts, tools and software written by real hackers, he is called a script kiddie. A security breach occurs when sensitive or confidential data is leaked, stolen or destroyed by an unauthorized individual, a hacker. This security breach can be avoided in general by concentrating on the elements of information security. What are the elements of information security? Let us take this scenario of an online purchase of a t-shirt. Usually, one logs into the shopping website and adds it to the cart for purchase. When it comes to the payment part, the control is transferred to a third-party application that connects to the bank. What if an attacker is able to sniff your bank account password at this point? The confidentiality of the data is lost here, which is the first element of information security. Let's say you have placed your order and paid for it, but in the bill you find the delivery address to be a different one. Uh-oh, what happened? An attacker pushing himself between you and the server has tampered with the data and made the delivery address data point to his own address. The integrity of the data is lost here, which is the second element of information security. If an attacker is not able to fiddle with the first two elements of information security, they execute attacks like denial of service that would bring down the server, making the website unavailable to legitimate users. The availability of the data is lost here, which forms the third element of information security. These three elements form the CIA triad. Apart from these elements of the information security system, there are two more concepts that security relies on. They are authentication and non-repudiation. In the very same example of the online purchase, the authentication of a trusted user can be ensured by issuing an OTP to the user's mobile number. It ensures the conformity of a trusted source. Non-repudiation is a byproduct of authentication, which ensures that the data sent to and fro between the communicating parties originated only from the parties involved in the communication. An organization, in order to ensure the security of its information, conducts a security audit that involves calculating the risk factors. What is a risk? Risk is nothing but the possibility of losing a valuable asset. To identify the loopholes or danger in an information security asset, risk assessment involves classifying the risks into two categories, namely, inherent risks and residual risks. Inherent risk. This is the risk that is faced when no controls or other mitigating factors are in place to guard the information. For example, in an organization, the lack of physical security measures such as CCTV, door access control mechanisms, etc. poses a higher risk of vital information theft. Residual risk. The risk that remains after the implementation of all control measures. For example, an organization can control the physical access to its premises either by having a security guard or by using electronic access control. When the organization seems to have nothing to be guarded physically, there is no need for it to protect its premises with either of the securing methodologies. This is where the organization conducts a cost-benefit analysis of its assets against its safety measures. Irrespective of the results of the cost-benefit analysis, there are certain standards and compliances an organization is supposed to follow. These include ISO, International Organization for Standardization, 27001 and 27002. ITIL, Information Technology Infrastructure. COBIT, Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. PCI SSC, Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. And PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. Having seen what information security is and how information security is ensured by following standard practices, it's time to get to know how the attackers are able to get into the system. The process of exploiting a vulnerability in an information system to gain unauthorized access of data is called hacking. Hacking involves three phases: information gathering, gaining access, and anti-forensics. Information gathering. This is the phase where a hacker tries to collect as much information as possible about the target. Gaining access. Using the information collected, the attacker designs a blueprint of the target and executes attacks against them to gain access to the system. Anti-forensics. The final phase is to erase the tracks that would eventually lead a forensic investigation back to the hacker who executed the attack on the target. Course map. This course on information security is aimed at imparting the end users with the knowledge, starting right from the basics of information systems, the security measures being implemented, and the ways and means they get disrupted by hackers. The course map starts with imparting knowledge on how hackers gather information about a target, information gathering. An information system is comprised of individual systems, which, when connected, become a network, and when they start rendering services, they are known as a web. Even though information gathering and system-based cracking seem to be a good place to start, it really all starts with executing malicious software on the target system, or malware, and it would be unjust if it was not dealt with as the first step. Revising the flow, the course map starts with malware, followed by information gathering and the rest. This module covers ways in which a system can be attacked to gain information, system-based cracking, while this one deals with attacks pertaining to wired and wireless infrastructure of a group of systems known as network-based cracking. Following this is the web-based cracking module. By now, you would have noticed that all the topics are covered from a hacker's point of view, and you will be wondering why this is not dealt with from a security officer's point of view. To be the best policeman, one should think about crime from a thief's perspective. In the same way, in order to be a good security specialist, one must think from a hacker's perspective. This module, Vulnerability Assessment and Penetration Testing, deals with the prospects of evaluating an information system and its security state from a hacker's perspective. A question keeps nagging even now. What will the defending mechanism be then? Since the course is designed to cover topics from a hacker's perspective, a clear idea of how the hacker works is imparted. Defining a single defending mechanism will do no good. For example, to arrive at the number 9, one person multiplies 3 by 3, while another may add 5 to 4, and a third may simply start counting numbers from 1 in ascending order to arrive at 9. In the very same way, a single fix will, over time, be easily exploited by hackers, and it is left to the audience to come up with their own defense mechanisms. Having finished with the introduction for information security, let us dive deep into ethical cracking. Introduction to malware. Getting started with the introduction, what is malware? Simply put, malware is the blend of two distinct words, malicious plus software. Malware can be classified as well as categorized. Beginning with the classification, malware can be classified into two types, namely user mode malware and kernel mode malware. This can be further explained with the help of protection rings, which are nothing but the layers of privileges within the architecture of the computer system. Protection rings are organized in a hierarchical form, starting from ring 0, which is the most privileged layer, to ring 3, which is the least privileged layer. The intermediary rings 1 and ring 2 are comprised of the drivers that facilitate communication between ring 0 and 3. The one targeting ring 0 is termed as kernel mode malware. For instance, let us have a look on this system that consists of applications such as VLC, Notepad and MS Office, etc., on top of OS. When the kernel mode malware corrupts the kernel program that controls the MS Office application, the link between the application and the OS is broken. None of the existing files or any new instances related to the MS Office application, that is Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., can be accessed. The one targeting ring 3 is called user mode malware. When this malware affects a Word application file, it results in corruption only of those infected files. This clearly means that an existing Word file can be accessed, or a new instance of the same Office application can be created without any hindrance. Having learnt about how malware is classified, let us move into categorizing malware. Categorization of malware. Malware can be categorized into 4 groups, namely virus, worm, Trojan, and backdoor. Malware. The objective here is to study the characteristics, behavior, and purpose of malware. Know the architecture of malware. Learn how to create malware. Learn how to remove malware. Learn how an antivirus detects malware. And learn how to bypass an antivirus. At the end of this episode, one would be able to create malware, differentiate between the types of malware based on their characteristics, behavior, purpose, and architecture, and defend against malware. Virus. Stepping into action, the first category of malware, virus, is the most prevalent one. What is a virus? Virus stands for Vital Information Resource Under Siege. Virus is nothing but a piece of code affecting the normal behavior of a system. Components of virus. Virus comprises of the following components, namely concealer, payload, and replicator. As the name suggests, this component concealer helps in anti-detection by concealing itself to look like a benign application. The payload is the actual malcode holding the executable instructions, and the final component, the replicator, is the one which helps the virus to craft duplicate copies of itself. Now let us have a look at the characteristics of virus with respect to each component. The component concealer is responsible for making the virus appear stealthy, which allows it to implement its intent in secrecy and to evade the antivirus. The next component, payload, allows the virus to carry another virus, affecting a specific individual host, meaning it is host-specific. One may think formatting one's system helps to get rid of the virus if present. However, viruses remain even after a system format. This is accomplished with the help of the replicator and payload components. Having learnt the basic information, such as characteristics and components of a virus, have you ever wondered how to create one such virus? To create a virus, one must know the life cycle, that is, phases of a virus. These involve 6 stages, starting from origination, transmission, triggering, infection, identification, and removal. The first phase, origination, is the place where a virus is born. Normally, a virus can only be created when one thinks from the attacker's point of view. Tech geeks will always love to build a virus by coding a program. The basic requirements to code a virus include an OS, Notepad application, and a programming language which you are familiar with. From the wide range of programming languages available, we have opted for DOS commands. Having enumerated the requirements, let us get into our mission. To create a virus, just open the Notepad application, key in the following code, and save the file with a name, followed by the extension .bat, and with Save As, type to all files in any desired folder. Your virus is ready. Before proceeding to the next stage, please stop. It would be mean of us not to tell you the easiest way to create a virus. We would all be very happy for our work to be done with a single click of a button. Let us show you how to use a tool to accomplish our task. The requirements for creating a virus using tool include the much-needed OS and a virus maker tool. Here we opt for Delmay's Batch Virus Maker. Opening Delmay's Batch Virus Maker tool, navigating to the Payload tab and clicking on Spam with Message box, name your virus and click on Save As.bat for saving it in any desired folder. Having created a virus, what would be the point in keeping it to oneself? Worm. Having infected an individual host, the next target of any attacker would be to infect the network, which can be achieved with the help of a worm. So, what do you think a worm is? A worm is a network-specific, self-replicating computer program that propagates over the network. In order to implement its malicious intent, a worm comprises of the following components. The first component being Scanner. It looks for vulnerabilities in the victim's system. Once a vulnerability is found, the second component, Penetration Tool, is used to exploit this vulnerability. This paves the way for the next component, Installer, to bypass all the security mechanisms and inject the malicious code, that is, payload, into the victim's system. The final component, Discovery Tool, is the one that leads to the worm being called a network-specific worm, as it discovers the systems that are networked with the victim's machine. Trojan. The third type of malware is the Trojan. A Trojan disguises itself as a benign application, say for instance an antivirus update or a game or an advertisement, by wrapping itself up to the application. Trojan is a destructive piece of code with payload, concealer and wrapper as its components. Payload. It is the actual piece of malcode that does the destructive work. Concealer. It uses concealment techniques in order to hide itself and prevent itself from being identified by any anti-malware programs. Renaming. It renames itself as a non-malicious application, e.g. trojan.bat, to run DLL. Corruption. It corrupts the security software in the system, which is responsible for detecting the malware. Polymorphic code. As the name says, polymorphic code is the code that changes itself each time it runs, but the function of the code or its semantics will not change at all. For example, if the key to deliver the payload is 12, the code used to achieve this result varies, such as 6 by 2 or 2 by 6. Having seen this, let's move on to the final component, wrapper. Wrapper is the benign application that covers the Trojan and helps it to run in the background. Trojan allows one to gain access of another system, making the infected system respond to it that appears like a client-server architecture. A normal communication channel between a client and a server is termed as an overt channel. However, when the client, which is the attacker, sends a payload to the server, which is the victim, the attacker gains access to the victim's machine. This communication channel, normally known as overt channel, becomes a covert channel when used to perform unauthorized activities. Let us now get to knowing the final category of malware, backdoor. What is a backdoor? It is a small piece of malicious code that gains access to a system, bypassing all authentication mechanisms. Backdoor comprises of a single component, which is a piece of malicious code called a payload. When it is sent from one machine to another, where the receiver executes the code, the sender acquires full access of the receiver's system. As seen, backdoor is a method whereby one system gains access to another system, which follows client-server architecture. A normal communication between a client and a server is termed as an overt channel. However, when the client, which is the attacker, sends the malicious payload to the server, that is the victim, for gaining access to the victim's machine, the overt channel becomes a covert channel.
Antivirus. It would be unfair to sign off without discussing antivirus, which takes care of this malicious software, which would be absolutely unmanageable to remove manually. What is antivirus? A protective software designed to defend your computer against malicious software is termed as antivirus. It has derived its name due to its first inception, where it was purely designed to defend against the category of malware, virus. How does antivirus work? An antivirus protects the system in two modes. First is the interactive mode, where the AV is kept running in the background all the time. When an external drive is inserted, it checks the files inside and prevents malicious files from being opened. The other mode is the scan mode. When this is enabled on a timely basis, the critical areas of the system, such as the registry, startup, services, and task manager, are monitored.
Information gathering. Objective: to study and gather information about the target, which may include any of the following: an individual, an organization, web, system, or network. This is done via direct intrusion or indirect abstraction of information. Outcome: on completion of this chapter, one would have a complete blueprint of the security status irrespective of the target being any of the following: system, web, or network. Having got an idea about hacking and cracking, let's get into the process of launching an attack. But whom are you going to attack? The first and foremost task here is to fix the target, which may be an individual or an organization. So, let's fix a target, say Mr. XXX and XYZ and Co. Now, let's attack. Launching an attack now leads to gathering information about the target. What is information gathering? Information gathering is the preparatory phase for an attack that involves a collection of information to reveal holes in a system. This process is also called reconnaissance, which is the term the military uses when it has to gather information in order to study the enemy. Reconnaissance can be done in two ways: passive or active. Passive reconnaissance is the method of gathering information without directly intruding on the target, that is, by probing the web. Active reconnaissance involves direct intrusion on the target to collect information. Now that the target is fixed, let's probe the target for information. But what is happening? The target is able to track the attacker. What happened when the probe was initiated? Whenever a request is sent to a server, say for example, whatismyip.com, it captures the actual IP of the sender. What can be done to avoid from being traced? Masking identity. In order to hide the actual IP, a person can send the request via another machine, making it act as a proxy server in order to mask the identity. Routing the traffic from the attacker's system to the proxy involves tunneling. Tunneling is the creation of a private channel between two nodes via the public network, that is the internet, where the channel can be secured using protocols such as SSH, HTTP, L2TP, etc. Masking identity is done when carrying out either active or passive reconnaissance. For carrying out passive reconnaissance, the following methods can be followed: SSH tunneling, HTTP tunneling, or Tor. For carrying out active reconnaissance, which involves anonymous application usage against the target, the following methods can be used: proxy chains or proxy trojans. VPN or virtual private network can be used for masking identity while carrying out both active and passive reconnaissance. SSH tunneling. What is SSH? Secure Shell is a protocol that runs on port 22 to ensure secure data communication between two systems. This secure data communication is achieved by establishing an encrypted channel called an SSH tunnel. The process of creating the channel is known as SSH tunneling. Let's see how an attacker makes use of SSH tunneling to mask his identity. Consider this. An attacker is trying to access a server called whatismyip from his browser. When a request is initiated from the browser, the traffic is directed to port 80 and uses the gateway IP of the system or the network to reach the destination server, whatismyip. When the whatismyip server receives the request, it enumerates the source IP as the attacker's IP. In order to route the browser's traffic via a remote server using SSH tunneling, the attacker creates an account on a remote server which renders shell services. Once an account is created, then with 2 simple steps, an SSH tunnel can be established between the attacker's browser and the remote server by configuring the browser and a shell client application, for example, PuTTY. Step 1. Rerouting browser traffic. The normal browser traffic routed via the gateway should be rerouted via a proxy server. This can be done by configuring the browser by choosing the option Use Proxy Server for your LAN to use SOCKS proxy. The LAN is then configured to use loopback IP 127.0.0.1 via port 8080, an alternative port for port 80 as a source port. Step 2. Bridging client and server. Creating a bridge between the client's port as the source port and the remote server port as the destination port can be done using an SSH client application, such as PuTTY. The configuration of PuTTY is done by entering the settings pertaining to the remote server that requires the name of the remote server, for example shell.cjb.net, the port on the remote server to which the traffic has to be forwarded, that is 22, the connection type pertaining to the port, that is SSH, and the name for these configurations, for example test. Settings pertaining to the client requires the source port, which is configured as 8080 in the browser, and the type of connection is set to dynamic, which tunnels all traffic to remote destinations via this port. Having set the source and destination, the remote server account can be accessed via PuTTY by providing the correct login credentials. Upon successful login, an SSH tunnel will be established between the attacker's browser and the remote server. When the attacker initiates a request to whatismyip server, the traffic gets routed to the loopback address on port 8080, which is now connected with port 22 on the remote server. When the whatismyip server receives the request, it enumerates the source IP as the proxy's IP instead of the attacker's IP. This is how an attacker masks his identity using SSH tunneling. Individual profiling. Our target may be an individual or an organization, which paves the way to collecting their respective profiles. Fixing an individual as the target, the thrust falls immediately in framing the target's social profile, where the vital thing is to find how people call the individual, which may be his or her pet name or nickname. Next comes finding the way to contact the individual, which is primarily via the email ID. Look at social networking sites and communities such as Facebook, Twitter, Google Groups, MySpace, About.me, Netlog, Badoo, Orkut, Meetup, High5, and Tagged. These reveal the name, email ID, and also the likes and interests of an individual. Not many are aware of the information that they post on their Facebook wall. Looks of the target individual can be extracted, and by tracking the status messages of the individual, which includes the physical location of the places they loiter, a physical attack on the target individual can be launched. Google Groups provide a shared user interface that allows threaded conversations among like-minded people. Meetup differs from other social networking sites in a way that facilitates offline group meetings, which provide a way to interact with people unified with common interests. People search websites to help in locating the physical address of the target individual. Such sites include 411.com, Anywho, Yellow Pages, peoplefinders.com,
personlookup.com.au, PeakU, PeopleSmart, People, Zaba Search, and 192.com. 192.com reveals the physical location of the individual along with the phone number of people residing in the UK, whereas Zaba Search is yet another website that allows a person to acquire the location of an individual in the US. Believing that the target individual is the only source to gather information is not a good idea. Finding the house inmates or the target's close associates, that is, relatives, make the job easier. Family-tree.co.uk is a website that allows tracking information about the people in the UK, and the website search.ancestry.com allows tracking the very same information for people in and around European countries. There are times when you might have arrived at a phone number but not the name of the target, or vice versa. In this case, Truecaller, a telephone lookup and reverse lookup directory, can lend a helping hand. Retro-sleuth.com is yet another website offering the same service. Every individual does something to earn their living. They often appear differently in this career world than they do in their social world. This leads to framing one's career profile. People are often called by their nicknames in the social networking world, but they may not be known with the same name when it comes to their work arena. And this information needs to be gathered. LinkedIn plays a vital role in managing one's professional identity. When surfing for a profile in LinkedIn, it may reveal the official email ID for contacting the individual and professional details such as skill sets, recently acquired skills, organization associations, domain names, experience, professional network connections. Other business networking sites also aim to provide the same service, such as TalkBizNow, Viadeo, BranchOut, and Zing. BranchOut is a Facebook application that spits out both social and professional information, which includes work history and corporate relationships of the target on a dashboard. Consolidating the information gathered, the individual profile of the target is done. Email address harvesting. What is email address harvesting? Obtaining lists of email addresses using various methods is called email address harvesting. Why do we do email address harvesting? Email harvesting allows the ability to track down other email addresses associated with the target and their network of connections. For harvesting the email IDs associated with the target, use search_email_collector, which is a module in the Metasploit console. Once the domain is set and the exploit is triggered, it searches for the email IDs associated with this domain in universal search engines such as Google, Yahoo, and Bing. It also looks for the email addresses on the domain's official site, social networking sites, forums, blogs, and guestbook. Once an email ID associated with the domain is found, it is extracted to be displayed. Harvesting of email IDs associated within an organization paves the way for launching the next attack. Network attacks. Objective: to understand what a network is, how communication happens in a network, how network attacks are classified based on the OSI model, physical layer attacks, data link layer attacks, network layer attacks, and transport layer attacks. Outcome: on completion of this chapter, the participants will understand how IT systems communicate with each other using a network, and how network attacks are performed based on physical layer, data link layer, network layer, and transport layer. Network basics. What is a network? When two or more systems or electronic devices are connected or linked together, it forms a network. Consider this network. This network has three LANs, namely ETH0, ETH1, and ETH2, connected to the internet via a router and a modem. Notice that there are different devices linked together in this network. But have you ever wondered how these communicate with each other? Imagine an Apple computer and Windows-based computer want to communicate with each other. It is like French and German communicating with each other. Do you think there is a possibility for good communication? Yes, if there exists a common language known to both. Say for example, if both knew English, it would facilitate the communication between them. In the same way, in order to accomplish a smooth communication between systems and networks of different architectures, OSI, Open System Interconnection Model, was introduced. OSI defines a layered framework for the travel of data from one system or network to another. It has 7 layers: physical layer, data link layer, network layer, transport layer, session layer, presentation layer, and application layer. Each layer in this model performs its respective tasks by communicating with the layers above and below it. Take for example that 2 systems, say a Windows and a Mac, communicate via a chat application wherein the Windows system is the sender and the Mac system is the receiver. Suppose if the Windows machine sends a welcome note, such as "Hi Mac," via this application, the data travels via these 7 layers and reaches the destination, after being operated upon by the underlying protocols. But what happens when the data travels through these layers? Let us take a look at the user interface that allows the Windows system to chat with his peer. This is where the application layer plays its role, controlling the application that allows it to communicate, along with the UI's look and feel. The application can also be a browser, a file sharing program, or something else. As mentioned, this layer has its own protocols, such as HTTP, HTTPS for web applications, FTP for file sharing, and SMTP and POP3 for the sending and receiving of emails respectively. In this case, the application is the chat client. Once the data, that is, "Hi Mac," is typed in and sent, the control gets transferred to the presentation layer. The presentation layer checks for the OS compatibility, encryption and compression of the data before passing it on to the next layer, which is the session layer. The session layer is the one that provides the mechanism to manage sessions, that is, the active time of a user on a particular web application. The session ID is assigned for the current session, and the data now gets passed on to the transport layer. Study on the OSI model reveals that the top 3 layers are called the web interface, where one can see the data being passed on without adding any specific headers. The 3 layers at the bottom are called the network interface. The transport layer is the one that acts as a mediator to shoot the data out as well as receive the data in. As the name says, this layer is responsible for the transmission of the data. It converts the data into segments of a limited size with a segment number for easy reassembling at the other end, along with a header called the transport layer header, which is either based on TCP or UDP. Let us take a glimpse at these protocols. TCP, Transmission Control Protocol, is a connection-oriented protocol which, when used, sends a probe using this TCP header. It consists of source port. It is through this port the client gets connected to the server. Usually the source port is an ephemeral port, which is nothing but a short-lived transport port assigned automatically from a predefined range that is always greater than 1024. The destination port is a well-known port on the server whose range falls between 0 and 1023. Sequence number, acknowledgement number, data offset, window size, checksum, erg pointer, and 6 other flags. To ensure a connection-oriented communication, it uses a 3-way handshake wherein these 6 flags play a major role. A flag is a 1-bit Boolean field to mark the occurrence of an event. Let us get to know how these flags are helpful in a communication. When host A needs to send data to host B, connection initiation is done by setting up the synchronization shortly SYN flag in the probe. When host B receives this probe, it sends a reply probe with reset flag when it is not available for communication. Otherwise, it sends a reply probe with synchronization acknowledgement, shortly SYN-ACK. On receiving this, host A sends a probe with acknowledgement, shortly ACK, to impart that the connection is established, and then it starts sending the data. This is called a three-way handshake, and this process of connection establishment makes TCP a connection-oriented protocol. When the data transmission is done, the sender can send a probe with finish, shortly FIN flag, which closes the connection. Apart from this, while in data transmission, a push flag can be set along with the data that would instruct the system to send data immediately. Or an urgent flag can be set, which will inform the receiving station that certain data within a segment is urgent and prioritize the delivery of this data. Next comes the user datagram protocol, which when used consists of this header. One may notice that the header consists of only the source and destination addresses along with the length of the data, its checksum and the data to be sent. Since it does not wait for any acknowledgement for establishing a connection and for transmission of data, it is called a connectionless protocol. This protocol is best when used for query response or streaming. TCP is a reliable protocol when compared to that of the UDP, since it establishes a connection using the three-way handshake, ensuring a connection-oriented data transmission, while UDP simply transmits the data, terming itself to be a connectionless protocol. In terms of speed, UDP is faster than that of TCP, since this one does not wait until the recipient acknowledges any data transmission. Once the headers are appended, this layer concentrates on handing over the data to the appropriate application process on the host computers, wherein the control is transferred to network layer. Network layer is responsible for the host-to-host delivery of data segments from the transport layer. This layer adds a header called the IP header, consisting of the source and destination IP address, which is similar to that of putting a letter into an envelope with a from and to address, thus converting the segment of data into a packet of data. So, what is an IP address? Similar to that of a physical mailing address, Internet Protocol address is a logical address that uniquely identifies each and every system connected on a network. At this point, it is important to know whether the communication is going to happen between systems inside a network, that is baseband communication, or out of the network, that is broadband communication. The routing of packets from the network layer is taken care by the network layer device called a router. A router is a device that connects two different networks. It works based on IP addresses and routes the data packets along the network on deciding the next point to which the packets need to be forwarded. It acts more or less like a dispatcher. To put in simpler terms, the router acts like a traffic cop who forwards the traffic to destined places either from and to the internet or within the same network. Thus, the data is now transmitted to the next layer, the data link layer. This layer is further divided into two sub-layers, Logical Link Control, or LLC, and the Media Access Control, or MAC. LLC ensures reliable data transmission by appending sequence number to each transmitted packet before sending and sends back an acknowledgement for each received packet. When the MAC layer receives the data from LLC, it interacts with the physical layer below. This is responsible for creation of frames from the packets it received from the network layer, on appending a frame header and frame trailer. Switch and hub come into play at this layer. Unlike the router, the switch and hub cannot connect two different networks. However, a layer 3 switch can act like a router. Switch is a device that works based on the MAC address, that is the unique number assigned to each and every system in their network interface card. This device ensures point-to-point delivery of data. A hub is a device similar to that of the switch, wherein the difference lies in the delivery of the data. A switch is a unicast device that concentrates on point-to-point delivery, but a hub is a broadcast device and the data reaching the hub is broadcasted to all the other devices connected to it. Finally, the data reaches the physical layer, wherein the frame is converted either as a digital or analog signal, that is bit stream, and gets passed on via the wires, if the network is a wired network, or via air, if the network is a wireless one. Basically, this is where the network hardware seen facilitating the functions of the data link layer and the network layer get into action. As seen already, when two or more systems or electronic devices are connected or linked together, it forms a network, and these connections are made possible via connection cables. An Ethernet cable is one of the most popular forms of network cable used on wired networks. Ethernet cables connect devices on local area networks such as PCs, routers and switches. The physical layer thus forms the fundamental for all the communication, and it is revealed that 95% of network-related communication issues arise at the physical layer. Once the physical route to deliver the bit stream either as analog signals in a broadband communication or digital signals in a baseband communication is identified, the data is routed to its destination. Finally, the receiver gets the data in bitstream and the corresponding headers for all the layers are verified, and the application layer now displays the message to the MAC system. This is how communication happens between systems on a network. Having seen how communication happens between systems, one might have noticed that certain parts of the network here have not been touched upon at all. Let us get into knowing these things. Did you see that the router is allowing traffic that seems to be legitimate, while it discards the illegitimate one? This is because a firewall is configured at this point. What is a firewall? A firewall is a system that filters the incoming and outgoing traffic to avert unauthorized access to or from a private network. All messages entering or leaving the intranet pass through the firewall, which examines each message and blocks those that do not meet the specified security criteria. As such, a firewall can be described as stateful and stateless. When a firewall is termed to be stateful, it is capable of monitoring the entire content of the data packets, that is the traffic stream passing through it, and distinguish the legitimate packets that belong to different types of connections. When a firewall is termed to be stateless, it is capable of capturing only the source and destination IP. It does not monitor the entire traffic stream and does filtration based on the source and destination IPs alone. Did you notice the IP address of the router and the systems in the LANs are different? Why is it so? Just imagine a tech giant like Microsoft, which holds n number of systems to run their processes. If each and every system is assigned with a unique IP, the range of IPs available will surely be exhausted at some point in time. To overcome this issue, the ICANN, or Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, a non-profit organization, takes care of the coordination and maintenance of the databases of the unique identifiers, that is, IP addresses, and came up with the concept of subnetting. What is subnetting? The process of dividing an IP network into subdivisions is called subnetting. Computers belonging to a subnetwork have a common group of the most significant bits in their IP addresses. The addresses used for subnetting fall under the following series: 10.x.x.x series, 172.16.0.0 to 172.31.255.255, and 192.168.x.x series. When these multiple subnets with a common prefix are combined to form a large network, it is called supernetting. The IP address assigned at the router point is the public IP, and this entire network connected to this router is identified with this IP by the other systems on the internet. The IP address of each and every system inside the network is its private IP. This IP is not known outside the network. So how is it ensured that the data packets to and from the public network are delivered properly from and to the system in the private network? Here comes the role of the router. The router is configured to support a concept called NATing. NAT, Network Address Translation. The process of translating a private IP into a public IP is called NATing. When there is no large network and you just want to connect a router to two different systems in your home network, the concept of patting comes into picture. Port address translation is the process of assigning port numbers to the internal IP address of the machines connecting to the internet. This now facilitates the data transmission. Although all these implementations seem to be effective, the study on the growth of internet devices in recent times shows that the time where one internet device was used by at least 4 to 5 members has gone, and each and every individual now owns at least 2 to 5 internet devices, which eat up the available public IPs. This clearly shows that the number of machines connected to the internet exceeds the number of people alive on the earth. That's where the introduction of IPv6 came into play, which is of 128 bits in length and ranging between the following address space. This is how a network is and how the systems here communicate. Introduction. Having seen how a network is and how communication happens inside a network, let us dive deep into how network-based attacks are performed at each and every layer of the OSI model. Physical layer attacks. The mere concept of a physical attack implies that you have direct physical access to the systems on the network. Physical layer attacks include the following: eavesdropping, inserting a hub, and vandalizing. Data link layer attacks. This is the second layer of the OSI model, which works based on the MAC address of the devices connected in a network. Data link layer attacks include the following: MAC spoofing, MAC flooding, ARP poisoning, DNS spoofing, DNS poisoning, DHCP starvation, and rogue DHCP attack. Network layer attacks. The network layer works based on the IP address of the systems connected in a network. Some of the attack vectors that disrupt the communication at this layer of the OSI model include IP spoofing, sniffing, MITM, ICMP flooding, Smurf, ping of death. Transport layer attacks. The transport layer is the one responsible for the transmission of data across the systems in a network. The attack vectors that disrupt this transmission include TCP flooding and UDP flooding.
MAC spoofing. Certain free services offering web applications use this MAC address of the end user to terminate the free service after a specified time. At such times, one would like to trick the web application into believing the system to be another one by masking the MAC address called MAC spoofing. This can be done manually by opening My Computer, Manage, Device Manager, Network Adapters, and selecting its properties. Traversing over to Advanced tab, one may spoof the MAC address to any 12-digit hex value in the network address text box. Let us now check whether this got updated by scanning the systems in the network using Cain and Abel. Here it is. Your spoofed MAC is seen here. Data link layer. MAC spoofing. Media Access Control, or MAC as it is called, is the unique physical address on a system's NIC. Masking this MAC address is called MAC spoofing. Task: spoof your MAC address. Step 1. Open Device Manager, Network Adapters. Step 2. Right-click on the system's network adapter and select Properties. Step 3. Traverse to Advanced tab and select Locally Administered Address and key in any 12-digit hex value in the network address text box. Results: open Command Prompt with administrative privilege and type in ipconfig/all. you may find the spoofed MAC address of your system. Cafe Latte. This attack allows obtaining a web key from a client system by capturing an ARP packet, manipulating it, and sending it back to the client, which subsequently generates packets that are captured and cracked to determine the web key using aircrackng. Having landed upon this web-enabled network in preparatory phase, a Cafe Latte attack can be done in 3 steps. 1. Launch of the attack. 2. Capture packets. 3. Crack key. 1. Launch of the attack. Having done with the prerequisites for launching the attack, let's get into launching one. The command when given makes the attacker wait for a gratuitous ARP from any of the associated clients of the AP and grabs it to form ARP requests of its own and sets up a fake AP. Gratuitous ARP is a packet that is broadcasted by a client by setting the source and destination IP to itself and the dest port to this address, which is nothing but the broadcast port for resolving IP conflicts, updating ARP tables, etc. This GRAT ARP packet is captured to make one that will look like a legit one, and this is broadcasted to the network claiming the attacker to be the AP by changing its SSID to that of the legit AP. This will now dissociate the client from the legit AP and start associating the client to the fake one, thus making the client send back replies that would be encrypted with the legit key. 2. Capture packets. It's time now to capture the packets from the clients associated with fake AP to crack the password. Starting aerodump-ng using this command on WLAN 0 now will capture the packets and save it to the file named Cafe. ARP requests from the fake AP now generates many genuine ARP replies from the clients that are captured in the file named Cafe. 3. Crack key. Now that the large number of packets transmitted between the AP and the client are captured in a file, opening the same file with aircrackng allows cracking the web password. Aircrackng uses FMS and PTW attacks that are nothing but a form of cryptanalysis for attacking RC4 stream ciphers and do not need many IVs, that is, packets, to crack the key. The Cafe Latte attack allows cracking of wireless packets in an average time of 6 minutes, being the best case, while 2 hours to crack being the worst case.
The next encryption mechanism incorporated by this hotspot is WPA. What is WPA and how is it different from WEP? WPA. WEP uses a 40-bit or 104-bit encryption key, which do not change and needs to be manually entered at the access points and clients. To overcome this weakness, WPA came into existence. WEP generates a per-packet key by concatenating the IV directly with the passphrase or master key, which exposes the master key to carry out attacks such as FMS and PTW attacks. WPA stands for Wi-Fi Protected Access, which works based on 2 mechanisms, namely PSK and TKIP. The PSK is a client authentication method wherein the network admin assigns a passphrase containing up to 133 characters. This passphrase is XOR-ed with keystream, which is a combination of a random 32-bit key, with IV, which is nothing but the checksum of 32-bit in length, to generate unique encryption keys. These encryption keys are constantly changed on a timely basis, which is then shared between the clients associated with the network. When a new client gets connected to the network, authentication request is sent to the access point, which in return sends a response asking for the password.
A connection is established once the password is verified. PSK. Pre-shared key is simple and was designed for small offices and home networks that do not require an authentication server. However, the encryption keys tend to become old as time changes, since these keys are not generated dynamically upon login and are subjected to brute force and dictionary attacks. This paves a way to opt in for the second authentication mechanism, TKIP. Temporal Key Integrity Protocol enhances WPA by increasing the length of IV by adding an extra 32 bits to the original 24-bit, accounting to 56 bits, to generate a unique encryption key for each client. However, only 48 bits are used in practice because 1 byte must be thrown away to avoid weak keys. Supposing, for the communication between 2 clients connected in a network, TKIP takes an extra precaution by ensuring that the data packet has not been altered or modified in any way by the attacker. If the data packet seems to be altered, it is dropped off. This is achieved by the 64-bit message integrity check, commonly known as the Michael algorithm. TKIP employs a per-packet key mechanism to dynamically generate a new 128-bit key for each incoming packet. This avoids the same keys staying in use as they do with WEP. TKIP also provides a rekeying mechanism in which it changes the encryption key of an ongoing communication in order to limit the amount of data encrypted with the same key.
System-based cracking. Objective. The objective of this chapter is to make the audience understand how a computer works, the methods used to crack system security that target the operating system's memory management, process management, and file management. Outcome. On completion of this chapter, you will know the intricacies involved in the operation of a computer, the attack methods via which a system security can be cracked, Introduction. An information system is taken care of by the security management in such a way that it is in no way breached, thereby ensuring confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Why is security so important in the first place? Each and every piece of data is information, and irrespective of its size and nature, it can pose a threat when in the wrong hands. When the security of an information system gets breached, thus allowing unintended users access to sensitive data, it is known as a system hack or crack. Attacks pertaining to such a security breach can be classified under various categories such as password cracking attacks, cryptographic attacks, steganography attacks, process management hacks or game hacks, reverse engineering attacks, privilege escalation attacks. System basics. Inventions are inspired by the world around us. When the Wright brothers saw birds flying, they were inspired to invent the airplane. Likewise, the computer was invented after being inspired by the human race. What is a computer? Computer stands for Common Operating Machine purposely used for technological and educational research. We all have this question on our minds. How does the computer work? Let us first power on the system to find out how it works. When powered on, the power supply passes through the power supply unit and reaches a place called the BIOS, written on the memory of the motherboard. But what is a power supply unit? Similar to that of the digestive system that converts the food taken in by the human body to provide energy, the power supply unit converts the alternate current, or AC, to direct current, DC, for the supply of electricity to the internal components of the system. The power now reaches the motherboard. Similar to the human nervous system which connects each and every organ in the body, the motherboard is a typical board with a printed circuit in the computer holding the CPU, processor, and memory, and connects with other peripherals like hard drives, video cards, and sound cards.
The motherboard receives the power and initiates the BIOS, which is nothing but a non-erasable memory storage chip, also called the CMOS chip, which stores the BIOS settings. What is the BIOS? The first software run by a PC when the system is powered on is the BIOS, or Basic Input-Output System. It consists of the instructions to run the power-on self-test, or POST, which checks whether all the peripherals connected to the system are able to receive power. When the power supply is correct, it gives out a single beep, else a series of beeps will sound indicating a fault. Now, the BIOS initializes the hardware components such as the processor, graphics card, video card, sound card, fans, etc. connected with the system. This initialization is called hardware BIOS. Hardware BIOS initializes the processor and the memory first. What is a processor? Similar to that of the human brain that commands the entire functioning of voluntary and involuntary actions, the processor, also called the CPU or central processing unit of the system, is the hardware that performs all the instructions given to a computer. It consists of two main parts: 1. Arithmetic and logic unit and control unit, and 2. Cache memory. And this together forms the processor core. The arithmetic and logic unit are directed by the control unit, and with the help of the cache memory executes instructions on the system. The instructions are executed with the help of cache memory, which holds memory units called registers on processor chips for storing and processing the data using logic gates. A processor is a combination of one or more cores with supporting hardware and software resources. When there is only one core, it is called a single-core processor, and a combination of two single-core processors becomes a dual-core processor. And when two dual-core processors are combined, it forms a quad-core processor. A processor can execute n number of instructions per second. The speed of a processor is defined by the number of instructions it is capable of executing per clock cycle. The architecture and clock cycle of each processor differs from one make to another. If the processor is labeled as 2.6 GHz speed, it is capable of executing 2.6 billion instructions per second. Execution of instructions is carried out using the system buses, wherein system buses are the carriers of the electrical signals representing the machine-level language, bitstream zeros and ones. This is where the 32-bit and 64-bit processor comes into play. This can be explained well with an example of a highway road that consists of several lanes. A 32-bit processor is capable of handling data in and out via 4 lanes, each of which is 1 byte wide, thus supporting only a memory of up to 4 GB, while the 64-bit processor is capable of handling data in and out via 8 lanes that eventually supports memory above 4 GB. This enhances the speed of the system. Password cracking. The act of using various means to land upon or recover a password is called password cracking. Password cracking can be carried out either online or offline. Online password cracking is carried out when the attacker does not have access to the password hashes, while in offline password cracking, the attacker would already have obtained the password hashes. Both of them may be conducted actively or passively. Active password cracking. Intruding onto the victim machine directly to crack the password is called active password cracking. Key logging. Password guessing. Man in the middle. Passive password cracking. Cracking passwords without directly intruding on the victim machine is called passive password cracking. There is no direct communication between the attacker and the victim. Password sniffing.
Even though encryption methods provide a secure data communication, it does not prevent someone from knowing that something is being transmitted when intercepted and examined by a third party. So what can be done to hide the actual data within something else in such a way that even when intercepted, the third party will only be able to see the outer cover and not the actual info hidden within? To achieve this, steganography comes into play. The word steganography is derived from a Greek name steganos, meaning hidden or concealed, and graphine, meaning drawing or writing. Steganography, also known as concealed writing, is the practice of hiding a message within another message or a file within another file. When this is used in communication, it reveals nothing on interception. No one apart from the sender and the receiver can identify the existence of the message. Before moving further, let us get a glimpse of how steganography evolved from the past. Demaratus, the king of Sparta, sent a secret message on a tablet covered with wax. When it was received at the other end, the wax was scraped off to recover the message. During World War II, steganography played a vital role in the form of invisible inks, which remained invisible when used for writing. The actual message can be made visible if the document is heated gently. Next came the null cipher. A cipher, as already seen, is a method of encrypting text. Null cipher refers to a method of encryption where the plain text is mixed with the actual message. For example, in this sentence, "Please do not throw sausage pizza away." When the first letters alone are taken into consideration, it gives the first letters of the 7 layers of the OSI model. This is known as null cipher. Next was hiding information in images. Microdots were used to conceal a message. A microdot is a text or an image which is reduced in size to hide its contents, which are then read using magnifiers. Apart from these, with the help of spread spectrum, the data is divided into small pieces, and it is spread over the frequency channel of an audio file. Having gotten an insight about the history of steganography, it's time to get started. Types of steganography. Out of quite a large list of variants, let us stick to these 6 types of steganography. Image steganography, audio steganography, whitespace steganography, email steganography, text steganography, and document steganography.
The gaming industry has a huge audience. One important way the gaming industry earns income is by letting users play the game for free until they are addicted to playing the game, and then lock the higher levels of the game at a certain point, at which time the users are either asked to score a certain number of points, or to buy out cards, lives, digital cash, or to wait for a certain period of time to pass before continuing the game. At such a point, game hacks create a way to unlock the levels and score higher points. But how do you hack the game scores? Whenever you play a game, the game creates a process in your system memory and the scores you gain reside there. Game hacks are aimed at modifying these scores as stored in the memory addresses. Let us see how this can be done. Take, for example, this game, Score More. This game can be played both offline as well as online.
Objective: to understand how web works, what is cruise missile architecture, how client-based attacks are performed, how server-based attacks are performed, how application-based attacks are performed. Outcome: on completion of this chapter, the participants will understand how web works and what cruise missile architecture is, how client, server and application-based attack vectors are performed. www. World Wide Web. Commonly known as the web, is a collection of electronic hypertext documents stored in a computer, linked together like a spider's web, which can be accessed via internet. Let's take a live example to get an idea of how the web works. The web browser is a software program to access information from the web. For example, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari, Chrome, etc. In a day, 3.3 billion searches happen on Google. Let's see exactly what happens when you type www.google.com and click Enter on your web browser. The browser parses this URL into 3 parts: protocol name, server name, and the path to the page in the server. Blank space usually denotes the index as the path. By default,
When a page request is made, it fetches the index.html page, whereas a specific path, say about.html, is mentioned, it fetches about.html from the corresponding server. When this passed URL comes out of the browser, it becomes an HTTP request, consisting of the following parts. Let us discuss these parts briefly. Request line consists of three components such as method, the path to the page on the server, and HTTP version. The method is used to forward the request to the server. The predominant methods used are GET and POST. A normal GET request looks like this, wherein the parameters such as username and password are passed on the URL. A typical POST request appears to be like this, in which all parameters are passed in the message body itself. By default, the first request method will be GET. However, the consecutive request method depends on the application, which may either be GET or POST. General headers consists of the timestamp of the request, the connection type between the client and the server that may be persistent or closed. Request headers consists of the domain name of the server, acceptable type of the page, either text, image, or application on HTML, the type of browser that initiated the request. Entity headers are optional and are followed by a carriage return or line feed to represent the demarcation between the headers and the message body. Message body contains the actual content. This HTTP request is then passed on to the router, from where it is routed to a proxy server. If set, the proxy server acts as a mediator between the client and the server to serve the following purposes: audit, for maintenance of network logs; internet usage, to report effective utilization of bandwidth; and caching, for speedy retrieval of the web pages. Generally, the request is forwarded to the firewall, but in some cases the proxy is placed after the firewall, that is, outside the network, in order to conceal the identity of the network. Now the request is passed onto the firewall that is conventionally designed to control ports and is allowed to gain access between the clients and the server. One may often get confused with terminologies such as proxy, firewall, and proxy firewall. Let's see the difference between a proxy and a firewall. When a proxy receives a request, it checks the access list for the application layer protocols. Based on this, the proxy forwards or blocks the request. When a firewall receives a request, it checks the access list for the ports. However, an application-level firewall also checks for programs in the access list. The request gets forwarded or dropped based on this list. When the request goes out of your network, the HTTP request header has the information of the domain name of the server, which it has to reach, but remains unaware of its IP location. For the very reason the request goes to the domain name server, the DNS translates the domain name to its corresponding IP address. Once it gets the server IP, the request is forwarded to the corresponding server. So, what is a server? As the name implies, it is a computer that serves the requests from the clients. What is a web server? When the server service, such as Apache, Tomcat, IIS, or Zeus, is installed on a computer, it becomes a web server capable of handling requests for the static pages. Installing services such as Oracle WebLogic or Glassfish over a web server will transform it into a web application server. This is capable of handling requests to process them based on the business logic and to respond accordingly. The business logic may be implemented using a web application or a web service. What is a web application? It is a program written using packages such as Java, PHP, Python, Ruby, etc. to accomplish a task. Example, Google Maps. What is a web service? When a web application uses open standards such as XML, SOAP, and HTTP to provide interoperability between applications running on different platforms, they are termed as web services. Consider an example, www.virustotal.com. This website fetches services from various antivirus web applications such as Bitdefender, Avira, Avast, etc. in order to give a consolidated report. What is a database server? Software such as MySQL, MSSQL, PostgreSQL, etc. provides database services to other programs like web applications and web services called a database server. In this case, our request www.google.com is for a static web page from google.com. The request for this static web page is handled by a web server. Suppose if the request is for a location on Google Maps, it will be processed by the web application server to fetch the corresponding result from the database, which is managed by the database server. When the request is for fetching a file from a server, it is handled by a file server. What is a file server? A computer installed with software such as FileZilla, Logical Dock, Cerberus FTP, etc., which is purposely designed for storing, sharing and publishing files, is called a file server. This again uses the DB server to access the requested file from the DB and returns it back to the web server to produce the HTTP response. When the request is for sending or receiving a mail, it is handled by a mail server. What is a mail server? A computer installed with software such as Mercury Mail Transport System, HMail Server, etc. for handling mail requests and responses is called a mail server. When the request is to send emails, the mail server uses SMTP on port 25, and when the request is to receive, it uses POP3 on port 110. When the requests are processed by the corresponding servers, it generates corresponding responses where the actual HTTP response looks like this and consists of the following parts. Status line. The request line of the HTTP request is replaced by this status line in the response. It consists of the HTTP version. Status code is used for defining the state of the web application or the web page that has been requested for. This is clustered into 5 different groups. If the status code falls between 100 to 199, it is meant for experimental purpose. 200 to 299 shows successful page access. 300 to 399 denotes redirection of the request. 400 to 499 denotes client errors, and 500 to 599 denotes server errors. Reason phrase. A brief description of the status code. For example, status code 404 denotes client error and the corresponding reason phrase is page not found. General headers consists of the timestamp of the response and the connection type between the client and the server that may be persistent or closed. Response headers consists of the name and version of the server that hosts the domain. Accept ranges may be bytes or none. When it is none, the client needs to wait until all the elements of the web page are rendered. When it is bytes, the server allows partial loading of the elements of the web page. Entity headers consists of the content type that gives information about the type of content in the body of the message. Content length denotes the length of the message. Last modified denotes the timestamp of the last update of the message. Message body, the actual response for the request. The response is then processed by the web browser to display the requested content. Next time when a user requests google.com, instead of fetching the response from the server, the browser processes the request using previously stored responses from web cache. A request that passes through a router, proxy, firewall, web server, web application server, and database server to fetch a response looks like a cruise missile, thus making us christen this structure of working as the cruise missile architecture. Client-based attacks. Phishing. An attempt to steal sensitive data via electronic communications by being disguised as a trustworthy internet resource is called as phishing. Phishing can be done by either of the following methods: redirection using localhost, redirection using server, base64 encoding. host file manipulation, and full screen API. The first method is redirection using localhost. Before stepping further, one must know what localhost is. Localhost refers to the default name of the computer, that is 127.0.0.1, which is also called the local host or loopback address. Each system has a distinct system name, say system1, and a unique IP address, say for instance 192.168.1.9. To make a system act as a server, one needs to install XAMPP. XAMPP is a cross-platform server stack consisting of a mail server, file server, web server, and a database server. Once installed, the XAMPP control panel can be opened. This now allows starting the Apache server, which will make your system act as a web server. As seen earlier, a web server is the one responsible for handling requests and responses. Let us see what happens when we type www.gmail.com into the browser. The request is handled by the DNS server, which translates the hostname to the IP address and redirects the request to the corresponding server. The server holds many files from which the default index.html file is fetched as the response. Similarly, when we type in localhost in the browser, the request is handled by a server running on the same system called the local host. This displays the XAMPP page as a response fetching its contents from the htdocs folder in the XAMPP server. When the content of this page is replaced with that of the Gmail phishing page, the response thrown for the request of the local host would be the Gmail phishing page. So, how do you create this phishing page content? This can be done in just 2 steps. Crafting the fake page. Go to the browser and type in gmail.com. Save the page in the htdocs folder after deleting the existing content with the name index.html. Making it work. Open Notepad, paste this piece of code, save it as mail.php in the htdocs folder. Thus your phishing page content is ready. When you type localhost in the browser, it will now fetch a Gmail phishing page. When a username and password is typed in, a request gets generated that points to the Gmail server for authentication. Uh-oh, what is happening? Rewinding back, when the Gmail phishing page, that is, index.html file, was saved as such, the action attribute of the form holds the link that points to the Gmail server for authentication. So what can be done to redirect this request? Replacing this link with that of mail.php and saving it will redirect the request to the local host server for authentication, which will be handled by mail.php. What happens when the request reaches mail.php? This piece of code redirects the victim to the original Gmail page while the request parameters, such as username and password, are captured. This piece of code creates a new file named log.txt in the htdocs folder and logs the user input such as username and password. Thus, you have completed a phishing attack. Now, when other systems within the network access the local host, it opens the Gmail phishing page. When a user keys in the login credentials, it gets logged and appended onto the log.txt file. Similarly, when the other systems, say System 2 and System 3, keys in their login credentials, the data gets logged and appended to the log.txt file. Redirection using server. This system, which is acting as a server in the LAN, can be connected to the internet directly without address translation. Now, share your IP address with the victim. When the victim accesses your IP, it leads them to the phishing page hosted on your system. Phishing, the act of acquiring sensitive data through any electronic communications by pretending as a credible source, is called phishing. Phishing can be done by any of the following methods: redirection using localhost, redirection using server, base64 encoding, host file manipulation, and full screen API. Redirection using localhost. In this method, the phishing page is hosted on the local host to phish a user. Note: open htdocs folder on the XAMPP server and cut all its contents and paste it in a new folder on the desktop named as XAMPP Backup. Task: creating a phishing page for Facebook. Number 1. Open browser and type in facebook.com. Number 2. Save the page as index.html in the htdocs folder of the XAMPP server. Number 3. Put this piece of code in a notepad and save it as mail.php in the htdocs folder of the XAMPP server. Number 4. Now open the index.html file with notepad and search for the action attribute and change the URL to mail.php and save the file. Number 5. By opening command prompt and typing in ifconfig, get your internal IP and try accessing this IP from another system in your internal network. If another system is not accessible, open your browser and type in localhost. Number 6. This now opens the Facebook phishing page. Type in the username and password and click on Login. Result: open log.txt file to view the username and password of the Facebook user. Redirection using server. In this method, the system in which the phishing page is hosted is connected to the internet directly. Note: when connecting to the internet directly, see to it that address translation is disabled in the router. The best way to make your system the hosting site would be to connect via dongle. Task: creating a phishing page for Facebook. Number 1. Open the browser and type in facebook.com. Number 2. Save the page as index.html in the htdocs folder of the XAMPP server after deleting the existing contents in that folder. Number 3. Put this piece of code in a notepad and save it as mail.php in the htdocs folder of the XAMPP server. Number 4. Now open the index.html file with notepad and search for the action attribute and change the URL over there to mail.php. Save this file. Number 5. Note your IP by visiting whatismyip.com and send this IP as a link to the victim. Number 6. Type in the username, password and click on Login. Result: open the log.txt file to view the username and password of the Facebook user.
SQL injection basics. Have you ever wondered what exactly happens when you type your username and password on a web page and click Login? The user input username and password is sent as an HTTP request to the web server, which hands over this request to the web application server that generates an SQL query to check the equality of the user by fetching the data from the database. But the question is, what is SQL and database? SQL, Structured Query Language, is the query that functions to fetch and access the data from the database. A database is a collection of data, arranged intelligently in terms of tables, with rows and columns similar to an Excel sheet. Rows are also called tuples or records, and columns are called fields or attributes. The combination of rows and columns is known as tables. The database server holds an information database called information_schema to store details such as the databases, tables, columns, views, and procedures on the server. For example, if there are two user databases, namely infisec and test, the information schema consists of read-only tables pertaining to infisec and test to hold the details of their structure, that is, the tables and their columns in the database. Information_schema.tables holds the details of all the tables in a database. Information_schema.columns holds the details pertaining to all the columns of tables in a database.
The details of specific tables and databases can be accessed using table_name and tables_schema, respectively. Generally, these values in the tables are stored as hexadecimal values. Let us take a look at the query that gets formed when the web application receives a request. Based on the user input, the query gets modified as follows. Upon receiving the request, the database server checks for the combination of the username and password in the table users that resides inside the database infosec. When the data is incorrect, it throws login failed as a response. When the data is correct, the requested data, that is, the account details of the user, is fetched as the response. This page in the web application allows the user to perform operations on the table. By clicking on the search button, the user details can be viewed. When an input, say 31413, and Chennai is given, it generates a request that gets forwarded to a web application server to generate the following query. This now fetches the list of usernames from the table users, whose contact number is 31413 and city is Chennai. In a select statement, the relevant data is fetched using either AND or OR logical operators. AND operator fetches a record only when both the conditions in an SQL query are true. For example, when an AND operator is used in this select statement, it fetches records of users who have both given contact number and the city as that of the user input. On the other hand, OR operator fetches a record if either the first condition or the second condition is true. In the same example, when an OR operator is used in this select statement, it fetches records of users who have either given the contact number or the city as that of the user input. This is how a select statement works. The result is now forwarded to the web app server, which sends it to the web server that delivers it to the client. The next button on the web application allows the user to delete a given record. Take, for example, when the user clicks on Delete and clicks on Confirm, it forms the query as shown. This deletes the entire record of the user whose ID in the database is 1. The next is the drop query. This action is allowed only for users with high privileges, and the query formed is of this form, which deletes the entire structure of the table users, along with the records in the table. Drop query and delete query does the same job of deletion. The only difference between them is that drop query deletes the entire table, while delete query deletes only the records in a table. This is how a delete and drop query work. The result of this query is now forwarded to the web app server, which sends it to the web server that delivers it to the client. View Account Details button allows the user to view all their account details. When a user clicks on this button, a query of this form is generated. The entire account details of a user can include details such as first name, last name, contact details, account, category, etc., which are maintained on different tables. Here, the details such as contact and city are located under table users, and details such as account and account category are located under the table user_info. In such a scenario, the union command allows obtaining a result set from different tables by combining two select statements with a condition that the number of columns selected in both the statements is the same. This is how a union command works. This command now retrieves the contact and city from the table users pertaining to user ID 1, along with the account and category from the table user_info, whose ID is also 1. The result is now forwarded to the web app server, which sends it to the web server that delivers the result to the client. This is how the web application processes the human understandable user input to generate machine understandable SQL query for responding to user requests. SQL injection. Instead of a human understandable input when an SQL query is injected to exploit the web application, either to breach the authentication system or to fetch unauthorized information from the database, it is called SQL injection. Objective: to understand how web works, what is cruise missile architecture, how client-based attacks are performed, how server-based attacks are performed, how application-based attacks are performed. Outcome: on completion of this chapter, the participants will understand how web works and what cruise missile architecture is, how client, server and application-based attack vectors are performed. Full Screen API. API, Application Program Interface, is basically a set of GUI components. YouTube's full screen option uses an API that fills the entire screen, called the Full Screen API. Let's see how a full screen API can be used to launch a phishing attack. Creating the fake page. Visit this URL and download this file. Once downloaded, unzip the file and copy its contents to the htdocs folder after emptying the folder. Now, open a browser and type in localhost, which loads this page containing a link to Bank of America. When this link is clicked, the status bar indicates that the request is being redirected to a legitimate Bank of America website. Now click on the browser UI. What happened? You are getting this message box stating that you have been phished. You have actually entered into a full screen mode wherein the Bank of America webpage along with the UI components are mere screenshots. That's interesting, isn't it? So, how does this work? Open the htdocs folder and right-click on the index.html page and open it with a text editor, say WordPad. Notice this just loads a screenshot of the Bank of America page and calls some scripts from there. What actually happens here is, when the link is clicked upon, it just does two things. 1. Browser fingerprinting, and 2. OS fingerprinting. Based on the browser and OS, it decides on the UI components to be used. For example, when the browser is Firefox in a Linux machine, it uses the corresponding UI components from this images folder, or when the browser is Chrome in Windows, it uses the corresponding UI components from the images folder. Now, a custom-crafted page holding the content of the Bank of America website gets loaded in full screen mode based on the browser and the OS. However, this page is just an image. But how to phish a user with an image? Within this image, form elements such as username, password, etc. can be embedded. When a user keys in the login credentials, it gets phished. This is how a full screen API attack is used to perform phishing. Full screen API based phishing attack. Embedding form inputs over an image using full screen API to phish the user is called full screen API based phishing attack. Task: launch a full screen API based phishing attack. Number 1. Visit this URL and download this file. Number 2. Delete the content inside the htdocs folder and copy the content inside the downloaded zip folder and save it inside htdocs folder. Number 3. Now open a browser and type in localhost, which opens up this page containing a link to Bank of America. When this link is clicked, your victim is phished. Result: the browser gets into full screen mode and the Bank of America website loads. When clicked on any place on the Bank of America phishing page, it throws a message stating that you have been phished.